Tonight, we descend into the peculiar, the psychedelic, and the deeply unsettling story of a molecule that was supposed to be medicine and became a weapon. This isn't the peace and love version you've heard. This is the story of how a laboratory accident became a tool of espionage, how a government agency dosed its own citizens without consent, and how a single chemical compound rewired an entire generation and terrified the establishment so completely that it's still illegal decades later. So before we begin this journey into the strange, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want more of these deep dives. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious who's awake at these hours with me. Phone away, lights low, let's go in. In a pharmaceutical laboratory in Basel, Switzerland, on a cold Friday afternoon, in November 1938, a chemist named Albert Hofmann was doing what chemists do. He was synthesizing compounds, methodically working through derivatives of a fungus that had plagued humanity for centuries. The fungus was ergot, a parasitic growth that infected rye and other grains. Throughout the Middle Ages, entire villages had been struck down by ergot poisoning, consumed by what they called St. Anthony's fire. The afflicted would experience convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene of the extremities, and agonizing death. Their limbs would turn black and fall off. They would see demons. They would dance uncontrollably in the streets until they collapsed. It was a plague born not of rats or fleas, but of bread, the staff of life transformed into a vehicle of madness. But within this ancient curse, modern science saw opportunity. Ergot contained powerful alkaloids, organic compounds with profound effects on the human body. Scientists had already isolated several useful medicines from it: ergotamine for migraines, ergonovine to control bleeding after childbirth. The Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company, where Hofmann worked, was in a race with competitors to find more. They wanted new circulatory and respiratory stimulants. They wanted compounds that could save lives. Hofmann's task was to synthesize and test various derivatives of lysergic acid, the common structural backbone of all ergot alkaloids. He was working systematically, creating compound after compound, each one given a laboratory designation. LSD-24 had shown some promise. LSD-25 was next on the list. He combined lysergic acid with diethylamine, a simple organic compound, following a precise chemical procedure. The synthesis was successful. A white crystalline powder emerged. Initial tests on laboratory animals showed nothing remarkable. The animals became restless, nothing more. There was no obvious medical application. The compound was filed away and forgotten. It was designated LSD-25, Lysergsäure-diethylamide in German, lysergic acid diethylamide in English. It went into storage. The year was 1938. The world was about to plunge into a war that would reshape everything, and this obscure compound would wait. 5 years later, Hofmann couldn't stop thinking about it. This was unusual, a chemist's intuition, a hunch that perhaps there was something they had missed. In April 1943, with the war still raging across Europe, he decided to synthesize LSD-25 again. Perhaps a more thorough investigation was warranted. On April 16th, working alone in his lab, he was performing the final steps of the synthesis when something went wrong. He began to feel strange, dizzy, restless. His vision became distorted. He was forced to stop his work and go home. He later described it in his lab notes. I was seized by a peculiar sensation of vertigo and restlessness. Objects, as well as the shape of my associates in the laboratory, appeared to undergo optical changes. I was unable to concentrate on my work. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. This lasted for about 2 hours. When it subsided, he was bewildered but unharmed. He was convinced that he had somehow absorbed a tiny quantity of the substance through his skin, even though he had been working carefully. The effect had been profound. But this didn't make sense. He knew the compound. He had handled far more dangerous substances without incident. Could such a minute, almost undetectable amount really cause such a dramatic reaction? There was only one way to find out. He would have to test it deliberately, scientifically, on himself. 3 days later, on April 19, 1943, Albert Hofmann prepared for his experiment. He chose what he thought was an incredibly conservative dose, almost homeopathically small, 250 micrograms. That's 1/4 of a milligram, a speck. For reference, the active dose of morphine is measured in milligrams, the active dose of most medicines in milligrams or even grams. He could not have known, could not possibly have guessed, that he had just taken a dose 5 times stronger than what would later be considered a powerful psychedelic experience. He had unknowingly ingested enough LSD to send an elephant on a vision quest. At 4:20 in the afternoon, he noted the time and swallowed the solution. Within 40 minutes, his notes became increasingly erratic. Beginning dizziness, feeling of anxiety, visual distortions, symptoms of paralysis, desire to laugh. He asked his laboratory assistant to escort him home. This was wartime Switzerland. There were no cars available for private use. They would have to travel by bicycle. What followed became legendary in the annals of psychopharmacology. The world's first acid trip, experienced on a bicycle ride through the streets of Basel. Hofmann's journey home, a distance of just a few kilometers, became a nightmarish odyssey through a dissolving reality. Everything around him was in motion, flowing, melting. His assistant's face morphed into a grotesque mask. The buildings leaned in, threatening to collapse. The road beneath him was not stable. It writhed like a serpent. Time became meaningless. He was convinced he was losing his mind, that he had poisoned himself irreversibly, that he was dying. By the time they reached his home, he was in a state of profound terror. He collapsed onto a sofa, unable to speak coherently. A neighbour, who was a midwife, was called. She could find nothing physically wrong with him. His pupils were massively dilated, black saucers. He begged her to call a doctor, certain that he had fatally poisoned himself. The doctor arrived, examined him, and found his vital signs to be completely normal. Blood pressure, pulse, respiration, all unremarkable. But Hofmann was clearly experiencing something catastrophic internally. He described it later. A demon had invaded him and taken possession of his body, mind, and soul. He saw himself as an outside observer, watching his own disintegration. Colours were impossibly bright. Sounds had colours. His furniture was threatening him. The familiar world had been replaced by something alien and terrifying. And then, slowly, the terror began to give way to something else. As the peak intensity waned, he started to perceive the experience differently. The fear receded. What remained was a sense of profound wonder. The play of colours became beautiful rather than frightening. His perception sharpened. He could see individual droplets of water in the garden, each one a universe. Sounds became music. He felt a deep connection to everything around him, a dissolution of the boundary between himself and the world. By the next morning, exhausted but unharmed, he was filled with a sense of clarity and well-being he had never experienced before. He knew with absolute certainty that he had stumbled upon something of immense significance. He had discovered a key to the doors of perception, a chemical that could unlock parts of the mind that were normally hidden away, locked behind the doors of ordinary consciousness. Albert Hofmann had not set out to create a psychedelic drug. He was looking for a circulatory stimulant, but in that Basel laboratory, he had accidentally synthesized the most potent psychoactive substance known to man. A single gram of pure LSD could provide 10,000 doses. It was active in amounts almost too small to see. It was a molecule that would change the world. But first, it would become a weapon. The news of Hofmann's discovery did not remain confined to the pharmaceutical literature for long. By the late 1940s, Sandoz was distributing LSD to researchers under the trade name Delicid. The company believed it had potential therapeutic applications, particularly in psychiatry. The mind was the final frontier of medicine, and mental illness was poorly understood and even more poorly treated. The available options were grim: insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, frontal lobotomies. Here was a substance that seemed to open a window into the psychotic experience, that could induce a temporary controlled madness. Psychiatrists began to experiment with it, administering it to patients, to colleagues, to themselves. Some believed it could help schizophrenic patients by allowing therapists to understand their subjective experience. Others thought it might break down psychological defenses, allowing repressed trauma to surface in therapy. But there were others watching, others with very different interests, and they were not wearing white coats. They were wearing grey suits and carrying classified briefcases. They worked for the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. The CIA, in the early years of the Cold War, was an organization consumed by fear and obsession. The enemy was not just military, it was ideological. The Soviet Union and Communist China were not just adversaries to be contained. They were existential threats engaged in a battle for the minds of men. American prisoners of war returning from Korea told strange, disturbing stories. They spoke of confessions they had made, of ideological conversions, of having been brainwashed. The word itself was new, terrifying. It suggested that the communists had discovered techniques of psychological manipulation so powerful that they could rewrite a man's beliefs, turn a loyal soldier into a traitor, all without physical torture. The CIA was desperate to understand this, and more than that, they were desperate to develop their own methods. If the enemy had a weapon of the mind, America needed one too. The agency began to explore every avenue of behavioral control, from hypnosis to electroshock, from sensory deprivation to pharmacology. They wanted a truth serum, a substance that would make a captured enemy agent talk, that would strip away lies and defences. They wanted a method of interrogation that left no marks, no evidence, and they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to find it. In 1953, the CIA launched a covert research program. Its cryptonym was MKULTRA. The name meant nothing. It was deliberately obscure, designed to hide the program's true nature even from others within the intelligence community. MKULTRA was an umbrella for over 150 separate sub-projects, conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies across the United States and Canada. The budget was enormous, the activities highly classified, and the ethical boundaries, to put it mildly, flexible. The program was overseen by the Technical Services Staff, a division of the CIA that specialized in developing spy gadgets, invisible inks, and exotic poisons. The man in charge was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was a complicated figure, a brilliant scientist with a PhD from Caltech, a man who raised goats and practiced folk dancing on his farm in Virginia. He was also, by all accounts, a true believer in the mission of the CIA. He was convinced that American security depended on staying ahead of the Soviets in the dark arts of psychological warfare. He had a club foot, a speech impediment, and a relentless, unsentimental commitment to his work. To Gottlieb, ethics were not immutable. They were flexible, contingent on the threat. And the threat, he believed, was absolute. He would later testify with complete sincerity that everything he did was necessary, that the safety of the nation depended on it. He ran MKULTRA like a research and development operation for a war that had no front lines and no rules. One of the earliest and most enthusiastic areas of interest for MKULTRA was LSD. Here was a substance of incredible potency, active in nearly invisible doses, capable of producing profound mental disorientation. Could it be used to incapacitate an enemy agent before interrogation? Could it be slipped into a drink at a diplomatic reception, causing a foreign leader to make a fool of himself in public? Could it be aerosolized and sprayed into a ventilation system, creating chaos and terror? The possibilities seemed limitless. Gottlieb himself became a devotee. He took LSD regularly, as did many of his colleagues. They believed it gave them insight, that it allowed them to think creatively, outside the rigid structures of bureaucratic thought. But they needed to understand the drug's effects on unsuspecting subjects. Informed consent was an obstacle to genuine research. If a person knew they had been given a psychedelic drug, their reaction would be fundamentally different. The whole point was to study the effects on an individual who had no idea what was happening to them, who would interpret the experience as a spontaneous psychotic break, or perhaps as a genuine paranormal event. And so, MKULTRA began to dose people without their knowledge. This was not an accidental ethical lapse, it was policy, a deliberate, carefully planned program of secret human experimentation. The CIA set up safe houses in New York and San Francisco. These were apartments maintained by the agency, equipped with two-way mirrors and recording equipment. Agents, posing as ordinary citizens, would lure targets back to these locations. The targets were often prostitutes' clients, men picked up in bars, people on the margins who were unlikely to report anything to authorities, whose testimony would be easily dismissed. They would be given drinks laced with LSD. Then, while they underwent terrifying, bewildering experiences, CIA operatives would watch from behind the mirrors, taking notes. They called it Operation Midnight Climax. It was a surreal, grotesque operation, government-funded voyeurism disguised as science. The man running the San Francisco safe house was a CIA agent named George Hunter White, a hard-drinking former narcotics officer who relished his role. He kept a detailed diary, describing the experiments with a mixture of clinical detachment and dark humour. But the safe house operations were just one thread. MKULTRA's experiments were far more extensive and far more disturbing. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a facility within a federal prison, Dr. Harris Isbell conducted experiments on inmates, many of them African-American men serving sentences for drug offences. The cruel irony was not lost. Men imprisoned for using drugs were now being used as guinea pigs for drug experiments. Isbell administered LSD to these men for weeks, even months at a time, giving them escalating doses to study tolerance and long-term effects. The men were offered heroin or reduced sentences as compensation for their participation. They had no real choice. They were captive subjects in a captive population. At McGill University in Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron, a prominent psychiatrist and the head of the World Psychiatric Association, conducted experiments funded by MKULTRA that can only be described as torture. Cameron believed that mental illness could be cured by wiping the mind clean, erasing pathological patterns, and then reprogramming the patient. He called it psychic driving. He would place patients, many of them suffering from depression or anxiety, into drug-induced comas for weeks. He administered LSD, along with massive doses of other drugs and electroshock therapy at intensities far beyond standard practice. He played tape-recorded messages on a loop, 16 hours a day, attempting to implant new thoughts. Some of his patients lost the ability to walk, to control their bodily functions, to remember their families. They emerged from his care as shattered, infantilized versions of themselves. Many never recovered. Cameron's work was a grotesque fusion of ambition, ideology, and callous disregard for human suffering, and it was funded by the CIA. Then there was the death of Frank Olson. Olson was a biochemist, a civilian employee of the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He worked on biological warfare agents. In November 1953, he attended a retreat for military and CIA scientists at a remote cabin in Maryland. Sidney Gottlieb was there. At some point during the retreat, Gottlieb, without Olson's knowledge, spiked a bottle of Cointreau with LSD. Olson and several other men drank it. They were all dosed. For Olson, the experience was catastrophic. He became deeply paranoid and depressed. He spoke of quitting his job, of the terrible things he had seen. A week later, he was dead. The official story was that he had jumped from the window of a New York City hotel room while under the care of a CIA psychiatrist. It was ruled a suicide, a tragic consequence of a man's mental breakdown. His family was told very little. Decades later, in the 1970s, when MKULTRA was finally exposed, a very different story emerged. Olson's son, Eric, spent his life investigating his father's death. Evidence suggested that Olson had not jumped, but had been pushed, or at the very least, allowed to fall. There were inconsistencies in the official account, witness statements that didn't add up, indications that Olson had expressed a desire to leave the program, to blow the whistle. Whether his death was murder, manslaughter, or a CIA-induced suicide remains unclear. What is clear is that a man was dosed with a powerful psychedelic without his consent, spiraled into crisis and ended up dead, and the CIA covered it up for 2 decades. These were not rogue operations. This was not the work of a few sadistic individuals. MKULTRA was a systematic, well-funded program that operated for over a decade with the full knowledge and approval of senior CIA leadership. It was the dark underbelly of the Cold War, proof that in the name of national security, the American government was willing to violate every principle it claimed to uphold. The men in grey suits had taken Albert Hofmann's accidental discovery and turned it into a tool of control, a weapon deployed against unsuspecting citizens of the very nation it was supposed to protect. They wanted to unlock the secrets of the mind. Instead, they committed atrocities, and LSD, the key to the doors of perception, became the key to the doors of a very dark room. But secrets, especially secrets as explosive as MKULTRA, do not remain buried forever, and the very substance the CIA had tried to weaponize had a peculiar way of escaping containment. While Sidney Gottlieb and his colleagues were dosing prisoners and prostitutes, a very different community was beginning to discover LSD, and they were not interested in interrogation or mind control. They were interested in consciousness, in therapy, in exploring the furthest reaches of human potential. They were psychiatrists, psychologists, and researchers who believed that LSD, far from being a weapon, was a medicine, perhaps the most powerful medicine for the mind ever discovered. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was a brief golden moment when LSD research was not only legal, but celebrated. Sandoz was still distributing the drug to researchers. Hundreds of scientific papers were published. Clinics from California to Czechoslovakia were administering it under controlled conditions. The results were remarkable. Alcoholics who had resisted every other form of treatment reported profound spiritual experiences under LSD that led them to sobriety. People suffering from terminal cancer, consumed by fear and pain, found acceptance and peace after a single guided session. Patients with severe depression, trauma, and obsessive-compulsive disorder showed dramatic improvements. The therapy was called psychedelic, a term coined by the British psychiatrist Timothy Leary from the Greek words for mind manifesting. The idea was not to cure the illness directly, but to catalyze a transformative experience, to dissolve the rigid patterns of thought that kept a person trapped in suffering. One of the most prominent advocates was a Hollywood psychiatrist named Oscar Janiga. His patients included celebrities, artists, and intellectuals. Cary Grant, the quintessential Hollywood leading man, famously underwent LSD therapy and spoke openly about how it had changed his life, helping him confront buried trauma and emotional rigidity. Aldous Huxley, the British author of Brave New World, became fascinated with psychedelics. He had taken mescaline, the psychedelic alkaloid from peyote, and written a book about the experience called The Doors of Perception. When he tried LSD, he was even more impressed. He believed it was a tool for what he called mind at large, a way to bypass the brain's reducing valve and experience reality in its full, overwhelming complexity. Huxley began to correspond with researchers to advocate for the careful, responsible use of these substances. He saw them as sacraments, tools for exploring consciousness that could elevate humanity. In Canada, a psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond was treating alcoholics in Saskatchewan with remarkable success. He and his colleague Abram Hoffer published studies showing that a significant percentage of chronic alcoholics achieved lasting sobriety after LSD therapy. The treatment seemed to work by inducing a profound mystical experience, a sense of ego dissolution and spiritual awakening that gave the patient a glimpse of life beyond their addiction. It was not a magic bullet, but the results were better than anything else available. At Harvard University, a young psychologist was about to take this research in a very different, very public direction. His name was Timothy Leary. Leary was an ambitious, charismatic academic with a conventional career path. He had a PhD from Berkeley, had published well-regarded research on personality, and had secured a position at Harvard's Center for Personality Research. In August 1960, while vacationing in Mexico, Leary ate psilocybin mushrooms, the sacred mushrooms used for centuries in indigenous Mexican rituals. The experience shattered his understanding of reality. He described it as the deepest religious experience of his life, more profound than anything in his Catholic upbringing. He returned to Harvard on a mission. He was convinced that psychedelics were the key to understanding consciousness, and he was determined to study them scientifically. Leary, along with his colleague Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, launched the Harvard Psilocybin Project. They administered psilocybin and later LSD to graduate students, volunteer subjects, and eventually to themselves and their friends. The early experiments were structured, with protocols and questionnaires, but the boundaries quickly became blurred. Research sessions turned into exploratory journeys. Leary's home became a gathering place for intellectuals, artists, and seekers. The professor and his students were taking psychedelics together, exploring consciousness in an atmosphere that was part laboratory, part salon, part spiritual retreat. Leary's evangelical enthusiasm began to worry his colleagues. He was too public, too bold in his claims. He spoke of psychedelics as tools for personal transformation, for creativity, for enlightenment. He was no longer just a researcher, he was a prophet. In 1963, Harvard fired Leary and Alpert. The official reasons were administrative. They had failed to attend faculty meetings, they had given drugs to undergraduates. But the real reason was that they had become embarrassing. They were violating the implicit rules of academic decorum. Leary was undeterred. If the university would not support his mission, he would take it directly to the people. He moved to a sprawling estate in Millbrook, New York, funded by a wealthy patron. Millbrook became the epicenter of psychedelic experimentation, a commune where dozens of people lived, took LSD regularly, and explored the philosophy of consciousness expansion. Leary began to develop a systematic approach to the psychedelic experience, drawing on Tibetan Buddhism, creating a manual called The Psychedelic Experience based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He spoke of set and setting, the importance of mindset and environment in shaping the trip. He believed that with proper preparation, LSD could be a tool for self-realization, a shortcut to enlightenment. And then he made a fateful decision. He decided to bring his message to the youth of America. In 1966, he gave a lecture in San Francisco that would echo for decades. He told the crowd of young people, many of them disenchanted with the materialism and conformity of American society, to turn on, tune in, drop out. The phrase became a mantra. Turn on meant to activate the neural and genetic potentials through psychedelics. Tune in meant to harmonize with the energies of the universe. Drop out meant to detach from the coercive structures of society. To the establishment, this was not philosophy. This was sedition. Leary was not advocating for careful therapeutic use of a powerful substance under medical supervision. He was advocating for mass experimentation, for a generation to reject the values of their parents and embark on an uncharted journey into altered consciousness. The genie was out of the bottle. LSD, which had been a classified substance in CIA vaults and a prescription medicine in psychiatric clinics, was now becoming a street drug, a sacrament for the counterculture, and the supply was coming from unexpected places. A remarkable figure emerged, a man named Augustus Owsley Stanley III, known simply as Owsley. He was the grandson of a US senator, a Berkeley dropout who had taught himself chemistry. Owsley built a clandestine laboratory and began to manufacture LSD, not by the milligram, but by the kilogram. His product was extraordinarily pure, a benchmark of quality. He was not interested in profit. He was a true believer. He wanted to produce the best LSD in the world and distribute it to the people. He supplied the Grateful Dead, the house band of the psychedelic movement, often for free. He funded their early tours, designed their sound system, and became an integral part of the scene. The Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco became the physical manifestation of the psychedelic vision. Young people poured in from across the country, drawn by the promise of a new way of living, of love, peace, and expanded consciousness. They called it the Summer of Love in 1967, but it was more than a season. It was a cultural rupture. Music, art, fashion, philosophy, all were infused with psychedelic aesthetics. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, they were the soundtrack. Their music was not designed to be passively consumed. It was designed to be experienced, to guide and accompany the journey. The light shows, the posters with their swirling, impossible lettering, the clothing, everything reflected the visual language of the LSD experience. LSD had escaped the laboratory, escaped the clinic, escaped the CIA's safe houses. It had become a social force, a catalyst for a youth movement that terrified the establishment. The kids were not just protesting the war in Vietnam or demanding civil rights. They were rejecting the entire system, the values of career, consumption, and conformity. They were exploring consciousness, questioning authority, and they were doing it with a chemical that could in a few hours dissolve the ego and reveal the arbitrary nature of social constructs. To the guardians of order, this was chaos. This was a threat to the very fabric of society. And LSD, the molecule that was supposed to be a tool of control, had become a tool of liberation. The CIA had wanted a weapon, but the weapon had turned on them. By the mid-1960s, the establishment was in full panic mode. What had begun as a fringe movement of beatniks and intellectuals in places like San Francisco and New York had metastasized into a nationwide youth rebellion. LSD was everywhere. It wasn't just in the Haight-Ashbury. It was on college campuses, in suburban high schools, spreading through the networks of young people with the viral efficiency of a pop song, and the authorities had no idea how to contain it. This was not like previous drug scares. This was not heroin or cocaine, substances with clear physical dependencies and criminal underworlds. This was a drug that produced no physical addiction, left no track marks, and was being used not by desperate addicts in back alleys, but by middle-class kids, college students, even the children of politicians and business leaders. The media response was immediate and hysterical. Television news programs and newspapers, always hungry for moral panic, began to run sensational stories about the dangers of LSD. The reporting was often wildly inaccurate, driven more by fear than by facts. One of the most persistent and damaging myths was the story of the kid who stared at the sun while on LSD and went blind. The story was repeated endlessly, offered as proof of the drug's dangers. It was almost certainly false, or at least grossly exaggerated. No credible medical documentation of such cases existed. But truth was not the point. The story had the ring of cautionary tale, and it spread. Another favourite was the chromosome damage scare. In 1967, a poorly designed study suggested that LSD might cause chromosomal breaks, raising fears that it would produce birth defects and mutations, creating a generation of damaged children. The headline screamed. Follow-up studies, more rigorous and comprehensive, found no such evidence. But the retraction never makes as big a splash as the accusation. The damage was done. Parents were terrified. Then there was the issue of the bad trip. The media portrayed every LSD experience gone wrong as proof of the drug's inherent evil, and it was true that bad trips happened. LSD is a powerful, unpredictable substance. In the wrong set and setting, with the wrong mindset, or in an unsafe environment, the experience could be terrifying. People did panic. They did show up in emergency rooms, convinced they were dying or losing their minds. Hospitals began to report incidents, though many were exacerbated by the user's own fear and the hostile clinical environment of an ER. If you were having a difficult psychedelic experience and were then strapped to a gurney in a brightly lit, chaotic hospital surrounded by doctors treating you as a drug case, the experience was almost guaranteed to become traumatic. The medical establishment, largely ignorant about psychedelics, often made things worse. But the media and the authorities seized on every horror story. A young man leaps from a window convinced he can fly. A girl has a psychotic break and ends up institutionalized. These stories, tragic as they were statistically rare. Millions of doses of LSD were consumed during the 1960s. The vast majority of experiences were not catastrophic. But fear doesn't operate on statistics. Fear operates on anecdotes, on the image of the young person, destroyed by a drug, a cautionary tale for every parent. Politicians, sensing both genuine concern and political opportunity, moved swiftly. LSD had been legal, or at least existed in a regulatory grey zone, for most of the 1950s and early 60s. Sandoz had distributed it as an experimental medicine. Researchers could obtain it easily. But as the counterculture adopted it, the government moved to criminalise it. In California, where the scene was most visible, LSD was banned in 1966. The federal government followed. In 1968, LSD was classified as a Schedule on the substance under the new federal drug laws. Schedule? I was the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. It was placed in the same category as heroin. This designation was not based on a careful review of the scientific literature. It was a political decision, driven by fear and a desire to control the youth movement. The reclassification had devastating consequences for research. Overnight, the work that psychiatrists and psychologists had been doing for over a decade came to a halt. Promising clinical trials were shut down. Researchers who wanted to continue their work faced Kafkaesque bureaucratic obstacles. The permits required to study a schedule and substance were almost impossible to obtain. The DEA treated academic researchers like potential drug dealers. Funding dried up. Universities, wary of controversy, refused to support the work. An entire field of research, one that had shown genuine therapeutic promise, was effectively destroyed. The irony was bitter. The government, which had spent years secretly experimenting with LSD on unsuspecting citizens, was now preventing legitimate scientists from studying it openly. And there was another, darker irony. The same establishment that was moving to ban LSD was the establishment that had created MKULTRA. But in the late 1960s, almost no one outside the CIA knew about MKULTRA. It was still classified, buried under layers of secrecy. To the public, LSD was a counterculture drug, a tool of rebellion. They had no idea it had first been a tool of the state. That revelation would come later, and it would be explosive. The cultural backlash was matched by a legal crackdown. Law enforcement, particularly the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, began to target the leaders of the psychedelic movement. Timothy Leary became a particular obsession. Hoover reportedly called him the most dangerous man in America. Leary was arrested repeatedly on marijuana charges, often in situations that seemed suspiciously convenient. He was convicted, his sentence is harsh. The government was making an example of him. If the profit of LSD could be destroyed, perhaps the movement would collapse. In 1970, Leary was sentenced to 10 years in prison for possession of a small amount of marijuana. He was sent to a minimum security prison in California. In September of that year, in a move that shocked the nation, he escaped. The escape was orchestrated by the Weather Underground, a radical leftist group engaged in a campaign of bombings against government buildings. They broke Leary out, smuggled him across the country, and eventually helped him flee to Algeria, where he was given asylum by the Black Panther Party's exiled leadership. Leary's escape turned him into a folk hero for some, a fugitive criminal for others. It also confirmed the government's worst fears. The psychedelic movement was not just about peace and love. It was entangled with radical politics, with groups that advocated for the violent overthrow of the system. Leary's time as a fugitive was brief and disillusioning. He bounced from country to country, Algeria, Switzerland, Austria, Afghanistan. He was arrested in Afghanistan in 1973 and extradited back to the United States. He spent several years in prison, sharing a cell block surreally with Charles Manson. The two did not get along. Leary eventually cooperated with authorities, providing information that some in the movement saw as a betrayal. By the time he was released in the mid-1970s, the counterculture had largely faded. The summer of love was over. The dream had curdled. The backlash was not just legal and political, it was also, tragically, medical. The uncontrolled spread of LSD had consequences. Not everyone who took it was prepared for the experience. Not everyone took it in a safe setting with trusted people. The street acid of the late 60s and 70s was often impure, cut with other substances or dosed inconsistently. Kids who had no framework for understanding a psychedelic experience were taking powerful doses at rock concerts or parties. Some had experiences that were genuinely traumatic. A few, already predisposed to mental illness, may have had psychotic breaks triggered or accelerated by the drug. The scientific community still debates this. LSD does not cause schizophrenia, but it may unmask latent psychosis in vulnerable individuals. The tragedy was that this happened not in clinical settings with trained therapists, but in chaotic, unsupervised circumstances. And then there was Charles Manson. Manson and his family became the nightmare image that haunted the psychedelic movement. The thing the parents had been warned about made flesh. Manson was a career criminal and manipulator who had been in and out of institutions his entire life. When he emerged into the Haight-Ashbury scene in 1967, he found a ready pool of lost, vulnerable young people. He used LSD not as a tool of liberation, but as a tool of control. He dosed his followers repeatedly, breaking down their personalities, their sense of self, their ability to think critically. He combined the drugs with sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological abuse. He created a cult. In August 1969, members of the family acting on Manson's instructions murdered 7 people in Los Angeles, including the actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. The killings were savage, ritualistic, intended to spark a race war Manson called Helter Skelter. The Manson murders were a turning point. The counterculture, which had been built on ideals of peace and love, was now irrevocably associated with violence and madness. The media covered the trial obsessively. Manson, with his wild eyes and swastika carved into his forehead, became the face of what happened when the young rejected society's values. It didn't matter that Manson was a sociopath who had perverted the psychedelic experience for his own twisted ends. It didn't matter that LSD was just one of many tools he used to manipulate his followers. The connection was made. LSD equals Manson. Psychedelics equal murder. The summer of love was dead, drowned in blood in the Hollywood Hills. By the early 1970s, the psychedelic revolution was over. The Haight-Ashbury had become a shell, overrun by hard drugs, heroin, and methamphetamine, and the predatory criminals who sold them. The commune in Millbrook had been raided and shut down. Timothy Leary was in prison. The music festivals that had been celebrations of peace, like Woodstock, were replaced by disasters like Altamont, where the Hells Angels, hired as security, beat a man to death in front of the stage while the Rolling Stones played. The dream of using LSD to transform society, to create a new consciousness, had collapsed. What remained was a scorched cultural landscape, a generation that had glimpsed something profound but had been unable to integrate it, unable to build a lasting structure on the foundation of the psychedelic experience. The establishment had won. LSD was illegal, demonized, and driven underground. The research was dead, the revolution was over, and the secrets of MKULTRA remained hidden, waiting in locked file cabinets for the day they would finally be revealed. The secret held for over 2 decades. The men who had run MKULTRA, who had dosed prisoners and prostitutes, who had funded torture disguised as psychiatry, who had pushed Frank Olson out of a window or watched him fall, they kept quiet. They relied on classification, on the institutional instinct to protect the agency, on the fact that the American public was distracted by other scandals, other wars. But secrets have a way of emerging, especially when the institutions that hold them begin to crack under pressure. The crack came from the Watergate scandal. In 1974, President Richard Nixon, facing certain impeachment for his role in the Watergate cover-up, resigned in disgrace. The scandal had shattered the public's faith in government. Americans had watched, appalled, as evidence mounted that the president had lied, that he had used federal agencies to spy on political opponents, that he had obstructed justice. The CIA had been peripherally involved in Watergate, and the new president, Gerald Ford, and the Congress were determined to clean house. They wanted to know what else the intelligence agencies had been doing in the shadows. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the success of Woodward and Bernstein, began to dig. And in December 1974, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times. The article detailed a massive domestic spying operation by the CIA, codenamed Chaos, which had illegally surveilled thousands of American citizens who were involved in the anti-war movement. The CIA was supposed to operate only abroad. Spying on Americans on American soil was a flagrant violation of its charter. The article caused an uproar. Congress launched investigations. In 1975, 2 congressional committees were formed to investigate abuses by the intelligence community. One was led by Senator Frank Church in the Senate, the other by Representative Otis Pike in the House. The Church Committee, as it became known, was a serious, thorough inquiry. Church and his staff subpoenaed documents, took testimony under oath, and began to uncover a catalogue of horrors. The CIA had spied on Americans, it had opened mail, it had infiltrated protest groups. The FBI under Hoover had conducted COINTELPRO, a program of harassment and disruption aimed at civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and radical organizations. And then, buried in the documents, the investigators found references to something called MKULTRA. What they uncovered was staggering even by the standards of the other abuses. The CIA had conducted mind control experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. It had dosed people with LSD, with other drugs, subjected them to electroshock, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture. It had funded research at universities and hospitals, research that violated every ethical standard of medical practice. And critically, they discovered that in 1973, as Watergate was intensifying and investigations loomed, CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the destruction of all MKULTRA records. Helms had sent a message to the archives. He wanted the files destroyed, shredded, incinerated, made to disappear. Most of them were, but not all. A cache of financial records stored separately had survived. These documents provided a map, a trail of payments to universities, hospitals, researchers. The investigators followed the money. In 1975 and 1977, survivors and victims began to testify before Congress. Some had been patients of Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill. They described going in for treatment of minor depression and coming out unable to remember their own children, their personalities erased. They were seeking answers, accountability, compensation. The CIA stonewalled. Agency officials testified, but they claimed ignorance, blamed rogue operators, insisted everything had been done in the name of national security. Sidney Gottlieb, the architect of MKULTRA, testified. He was calm, unapologetic. He insisted that the program had been necessary, that the threat from the communists had been real, that extreme measures were warranted. He expressed no remorse for Frank Olson, for the prisoners in Lexington, for Cameron's patients. He was a scientist, he said, serving his country. The public was horrified. The story of MKULTRA, when it finally broke into mainstream consciousness, was almost too grotesque to believe. The government, the CIA, the defenders of freedom had behaved like the very totalitarian regimes they claimed to be fighting against. They had treated citizens like laboratory rats. The irony was inescapable. The agency that had warned of communist brainwashing had been conducting its own brainwashing experiments. The guardians against totalitarianism had themselves acted like totalitarians. The revelations destroyed what little trust remained in the institutions of government. Coming on the heels of Watergate, of the lies about Vietnam, of the FBI's harassment of Martin Luther King Jr., MKULTRA was the final confirmation that the system was rotten. There were lawsuits. The Olson family sued. Other victims sued. Most cases were settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. The CIA paid compensation, but admitted no wrongdoing. Some victims were too damaged, too far gone, to even participate in the legal process. Dr. Cameron had died years earlier, escaping any accountability. Gottlieb retired to his farm, raising goats, unprosecuted. No one from the CIA went to prison for MKULTRA. The worst they faced was bad publicity and congressional scolding. The official investigations were limited. Many questions remained unanswered because the documents had been destroyed. How many people had been dosed? How many had died or been permanently damaged? What other programs existed that the investigators hadn't found? The full truth of MKULTRA will likely never be known. Too much was destroyed, too many participants have died, and too much remains classified even today. But the revelation of MKULTRA had profound consequences beyond the immediate scandal. It vindicated, in the darkest way, some of the paranoia of the counterculture. The activists who had said the government was out to control their minds had been dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Now it turned out they had been right, or at least not far from the truth. The revelation also cast a long shadow over the legitimate research that had been done with LSD. The association of the drug with government mind control experiments further stigmatized it. It became even harder to argue for its therapeutic potential when its history included being used as a weapon by the CIA. And there was one final, bitter legacy. MKULTRA had been a failure on its own terms. After more than a decade of research, after dosing thousands of people, after spending millions of dollars, the CIA had failed to achieve its goals. They never found a truth serum, they never developed a reliable method of mind control. LSD didn't make people pliable or controllable. It made them unpredictable. It broke down barriers, yes, but not in a way that could be directed or harnessed. The drug didn't create obedient subjects. If anything, it created questioning, skeptical individuals, people who were less likely to accept authority. The CIA had pursued a chimera, and in the process had committed atrocities. They had weaponized a molecule that couldn't be weaponized. The secret project had gone too far, achieved nothing, and left a trail of shattered lives and shattered trust in its wake. After the backlash, after the bans, after the revelation of MKULTRA, LSD didn't disappear. It couldn't. You cannot uninvent a molecule. The knowledge of how to synthesize it existed, written down in chemistry journals, locked in the minds of chemists who had been trained in the glory years. And there was still a demand, a persistent hunger from a subculture that refused to let the experience die. LSD went underground, into the shadows, where it would remain for decades. The manufacturing of LSD in the 1970s, 80s and 90s became the province of a very particular type of outlaw, the psychedelic chemist. These were not street-corner drug dealers or cartel operatives. They were often highly educated, ideologically driven individuals who saw themselves as continuing the mission that had been interrupted by the law. They believed in LSD. They saw it as a sacrament, a tool for consciousness expansion that should be available to those who sought it. They were, in their own minds, not criminals, but underground pharmacists, keepers of the flame. The most legendary of these figures was a man named William Leonard Pickard. Pickard was a Harvard-educated scientist with a degree from the Kennedy School of Government. He was brilliant, articulate, and deeply committed to drug policy reform. He had worked at the United Nations International Drug Control Program. He understood the law, the science, and the politics, and he also, according to federal prosecutors, ran one of the largest LSD manufacturing operations in history. In November 2000, the DEA raided a decommissioned missile silo in Kansas. Inside, they found a sophisticated laboratory capable of producing millions of doses of LSD. Pickard and his associate Clyde Apperson were arrested. The amount of precursor chemicals and finished products seized suggested that they had been responsible for producing as much as 90% of the LSD in the United States during the late 1990s. Pickard's arrest marked the end of an era. The supply of LSD in America dried up almost overnight. For several years, the drug became scarce, almost impossible to find. Pickard was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms in federal prison, a sentence so harsh it seemed designed not just to punish him, but to send a message. The government would not tolerate the production of psychedelics, no matter how peaceful or ideological the manufacturer's intentions. But even with Pickard in prison, the knowledge remained. Other chemists, smaller operations, continued to produce LSD, though never at the scale Pickard had achieved. The synthesis of LSD is complex, requiring sophisticated equipment and precursor chemicals that are watched by authorities. But it's not impossible. A skilled chemist with access to a laboratory can do it. And so the supply persisted, a trickle rather than a flood, but persistent. The drug found its way to music festivals, to gatherings of the deadhead community that had formed around the Grateful Dead, to raves and underground parties. It remained a sacrament for a dedicated subculture. During these underground years, the culture around LSD evolved. It became less political, less revolutionary. The idea of using psychedelics to overthrow the system, so prominent in the 60s, had largely faded. What remained was a more personal, introspective use. People took LSD to explore their own consciousness, to confront their demons, to have experiences of beauty and connection. The settings changed too. Instead of massive public gatherings like Woodstock, the scene moved to smaller, more intentional spaces. Raves in warehouses, parties in the desert, Burning Man, the annual gathering in the Nevada desert that became a temporary city dedicated to art, self-expression and altered states. LSD found a home in the electronic music scene, where its effects synergized with the repetitive, trance-inducing beats of techno and house music. And something else happened during these decades. The clinical research, which had been dead since the early 70s, began to stir. A few brave, persistent researchers refused to give up. They navigated the bureaucratic nightmares, jumped through the impossible hoops, and slowly, quietly, began to conduct new studies. In Switzerland, a psychiatrist named Peter Gasser received permission to study LSD-assisted psychotherapy for patients with life-threatening illness. In the United States, organizations like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, founded by Rick Doblin, began to advocate for psychedelic research and funded small pilot studies. These were baby steps, but they kept the flame alive. The researchers were meticulous, careful not to provoke another backlash. They emphasized safety, therapeutic protocols, and rigorous science. They were trying to undo decades of stigma and fear. The cultural perception of LSD remained overwhelmingly negative through the 80s and 90s. It was a relic of the 60s, a dangerous drug associated with hippies, dropouts, and madness. The war on drugs, launched in earnest by Ronald Reagan, painted all illegal substances with the same brush. Just say no was the message, and it allowed for no nuance, no distinction between the devastating consequences of crack cocaine and the relatively benign profile of LSD. The drug warriors were not interested in harm reduction or scientific evidence. They were interested in zero tolerance. LSD, despite being non-addictive and having a very low rate of acute medical emergencies, remained a Schedule E substance, classified as having no medical value and a high potential for abuse. The classification was absurd from a scientific standpoint, but it was politically untouchable, and yet, beneath the surface, the idea persisted. Books like Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception remained in print, quietly influencing new generations. Terence McKenna, an ethnobotanist and psychedelic philosopher, became a cult figure in the 90s, giving lectures about the transformative potential of psychedelics, about their role in human evolution, about the need to explore consciousness. He spoke at raves, at bookstores. His ideas spread through underground tapes and early internet forums. The internet, in its early unregulated days, became a repository for psychedelic information. Trip reports, synthesis instructions, philosophy, all shared freely in the digital underground. A new generation was discovering LSD not through the mass media or through Leary's evangelism, but through peer-to-peer networks and countercultural texts. By the turn of the millennium, something was shifting. The hysteria of the Reagan years was fading. A new generation of scientists, many of whom had come of age during the psychedelic renaissance of the 60s, were now senior researchers with the institutional clout to push for change. They looked at the evidence and saw what the politics had obscured. Psychedelics were not the demons they had been made out to be. LSD was not addictive. It did not cause violence. The chromosome damage was a myth. The risks, when the drug was used in controlled settings, were minimal. And the potential benefits suggested by the research of the 50s and 60s were profound. Why had this research been shut down? Why was this avenue of inquiry closed? The answer was political, not scientific. And slowly, carefully, the scientists began to push back. The underground years were ending, the ice was beginning to thaw, but the stigma remained, the legal barriers remained, and the shadow of MKULTRA still hung over the entire enterprise, a reminder of what had happened when a molecule met the machinery of the state. The 21st century brought something unexpected, something that would have seemed impossible during the dark decades of prohibition, a psychedelic renaissance. It began quietly, in academic institutions and research labs, with a new generation of scientists who were determined to finish what had been started in the 1950s. They'd grown up in the shadow of the war on drugs, but they had also grown up with the internet, with access to information that earlier generations hadn't had. They could read the old studies, the ones from before the ban. They could see that promising research had been interrupted, not because it had failed, but because it had become politically inconvenient, and they were determined to restart it, but this time with rigorous methodology, strict ethical guidelines, and a carefully cultivated respectability that would insulate the work from accusations of hippie romanticism. In 2006, a team of researchers at Johns Hopkins University published a landmark study in the journal Psychopharmacology. They had administered psilocybin, the psychedelic compound in magic mushrooms and a close chemical cousin of LSD, to healthy volunteers in a carefully controlled setting. The results were striking. A significant majority of participants rated the experience as among the most meaningful of their entire lives, comparable to the birth of a child or the death of a parent. The study was meticulously designed, double-blind, and placebo-controlled. It passed peer review at a prestigious journal. It was, by any standard, good science, and it reopened a door that had been closed for decades. Other institutions followed. Imperial College London, under the leadership of neuroscientist David Nutt and psychologist Robin Carhart-Harris, began studies using functional MRI to map what LSD and psilocybin actually do to the brain. The imaging revealed something fascinating. Psychedelics decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain regions associated with the sense of self, with rumination, with the ego. This damping of the default mode network correlated with the subjective experience of ego dissolution, the feeling of boundary loss that users describe. It was, for the first time, a neurobiological explanation for mystical experience. The research expanded into clinical populations. Studies began to investigate the use of psilocybin and LSD for treatment-resistant depression, for anxiety in terminal cancer patients, for PTSD, for addiction. The results, preliminary but consistently positive, were published in top-tier medical journals. Patients who had failed every other treatment were showing dramatic improvements after 1 or 2 guided psychedelic sessions. Cancer patients facing death found acceptance and peace. Veterans with severe PTSD experienced reductions in symptoms. Alcoholics and smokers achieved sobriety. The effect sizes were large, larger than most psychiatric medications, and critically, the benefits appeared to be lasting, persisting for months or even years after a single treatment. The mechanism was different from conventional medications. Psychiatric drugs like SSRIs or benzodiazepines are meant to be taken daily, indefinitely, to manage symptoms. Psychedelics, in this new therapeutic model, were not daily medications. They were catalysts for a transformative psychological experience. The therapy wasn't the drug alone. It was the combination of the drug, careful preparation, a safe setting, therapeutic support during the experience, and extensive integration work afterward. The psychedelic experience, properly framed and supported, could allow a patient to confront and process trauma, to see their life and their problems from a radically different perspective, to break out of rigid, destructive patterns of thought. It was, in a sense, a form of accelerated psychotherapy. The FDA, traditionally conservative, began to take notice. In 2017, the agency granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, a status reserved for drugs that show substantial promise for serious conditions. In 2019, it did the same for psilocybin-assisted therapy for major depressive disorder and for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. These designations didn't make the drugs legal, but they fast-tracked the research, signaling that the government was open to the possibility that these substances might have legitimate medical value. It was a stunning reversal after half a century of prohibition. Silicon Valley, always eager to be on the cutting edge, embraced psychedelics. Tech entrepreneurs began to talk openly about using LSD or psilocybin for creativity, for problem-solving, for mental health. Microdosing became a trend, taking sub-perceptual doses of psychedelics, not enough to trip, but supposedly enough to enhance mood, focus, and creativity. The practice spread through the tech industry, through the startup world. Whether it actually worked was an open question. The evidence was mostly anecdotal, but the fact that it was happening openly, that successful business people were admitting to using Schedule E substances, signaled a massive cultural shift. Investment money poured in. Biotech companies were founded to develop psychedelic therapies and bring them through the FDA approval process. Companies like Compass Pathways, MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and dozens of others raised hundreds of millions of dollars. They were building treatment centers, training therapists, conducting Phase 3 clinical trials, the final step before FDA approval. Investors saw an opportunity, a vast unmet need in mental health care, a novel mechanism of action, and promising clinical data. The psychedelic industry was being born, complete with all the promise and peril that entails. But the Renaissance was not without controversy. As psychedelics moved from the counterculture into the mainstream, into the realms of medicine and commerce, tensions emerged. The indigenous peoples who had used these plants for millennia watched as Western companies filed patents on molecules derived from their sacred medicines. There were questions about cultural appropriation, about who had the right to profit from knowledge that had been held by shamans and curanderos for generations. There were concerns about medicalization, about turning a profound spiritual tool into just another pill, stripped of its ritual context and reduced to a treatment protocol. And there was the ever-present danger of hype outrunning evidence, of investors and entrepreneurs promising miracles before the science was actually settled. The legal landscape began to shift as well. In 2020, Oregon became the first US state to legalize psilocybin for therapeutic use, creating a framework for licensed facilitators to guide adults through psilocybin experiences. Colorado followed. Cities like Denver, Oakland, and Seattle decriminalized possession of psychedelics. Canada began to grant exemptions for terminally ill patients to use psilocybin. These were not full legalizations, not a return to the free-for-all of the 60s. They were careful, regulated approaches, but they represented a sea change. The prohibitionist consensus was cracking. The Renaissance also brought a reckoning with the past. Researchers and advocates had to confront the history of MKULTRA, had to explain how this time would be different, how ethical guidelines and informed consent would be absolute principles. They had to distinguish between the careful, therapeutic use of psychedelics in clinical settings and the reckless, coercive experiments of the Cold War. They pointed to the rigorous oversight, the ethics boards, the transparent peer-reviewed research. This was not Sidney Gottlieb dosing prisoners. This was medicine, they insisted. But the shadow remained, a reminder of what happens when powerful tools fall into the wrong hands. And LSD itself, the molecule that started it all, remained paradoxically on the sidelines of the Renaissance. Most of the new clinical research focused on psilocybin or MDMA, not LSD. Psilocybin had a better public image, was associated with natural mushrooms and indigenous traditions rather than with the CIA and the counterculture. It was easier to get funding, easier to get regulatory approval. LSD carried too much baggage, too much cultural weight. But a few studies did proceed. Swiss researchers continued to investigate LSD-assisted psychotherapy. The results were consistent with the psilocybin research. Positive, promising, safe when properly administered. LSD was as effective as its cousin, but it would take longer to rehabilitate its reputation. By the early 2020s, the psychedelic renaissance was in full swing. Academic conferences on psychedelic science drew thousands of attendees: researchers, therapists, investors, activists. Mainstream media coverage shifted from sensationalism to cautious optimism. Articles in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and 60 Minutes explored the therapeutic potential. Celebrity advocates, from athletes to actors to tech billionaires, spoke openly about their experiences. The dam had broken. After 50 years in the wilderness, psychedelics were coming back. But the question remained: coming back as what? As medicine? As sacrament? As commodity? As all three? The Renaissance brought hope, but it also brought uncertainty. The molecule that had been a weapon, a sacrament, a symbol of rebellion, was now poised to become an FDA-approved therapy. What would be gained in that transformation, and what would be lost? We arrive now at the present, at the threshold of something unprecedented. LSD, the molecule that Albert Hofmann accidentally discovered on a Friday afternoon in 1943, has travelled a strange and twisted path through the last 8 decades of human history. It has been a medicine, a weapon, a sacrament, a symbol of liberation, a tool of oppression, a banned substance, and now, possibly, a medicine again. Its story is the story of the 20th century's obsessions, with science, with control, with consciousness, with freedom. And as we stand here, in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, we must reckon with what this molecule has revealed about us, about our institutions, and about the strange, fragile architecture of the human mind. The revelation of MKULTRA taught us that our institutions, even those founded on principles of freedom and democracy, are capable of monstrous acts when they operate in secrecy, when they convince themselves that the ends justify the means. The CIA's attempt to weaponize LSD was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a broader pathology, the belief that human beings can be reduced to mechanisms, that consciousness can be controlled and directed like a machine. It failed because that belief is fundamentally wrong. The mind is not a mechanism. Consciousness is not a system that can be hacked. LSD, rather than revealing the keys to control, revealed the limits of control. It showed that the attempt to dominate and direct human experience is doomed to fail, and that in the attempt, great cruelty will be inflicted. The backlash of the 1960s and the subsequent prohibition taught us about moral panic, about how fear can be weaponized, how a substance can become a scapegoat for deeper social anxieties. LSD was banned not because of a careful, objective assessment of its harms and benefits, but because it became associated with a youth movement that terrified the establishment. The kids were questioning authority, rejecting materialism, exploring consciousness. They were, in the eyes of the guardians of order, out of control, and so the substance they used became the target. The drug laws that followed were not about public health. They were about social control, and they remain so today. The classification of LSD as Schedule I, alongside heroin and methamphetamine, is not scientifically defensible. It is a political artifact, a fossil of the Nixon-era's culture wars. The therapeutic research, from the golden age of the 1950s to the Renaissance of today, reveals something profound about the potential locked inside this molecule. The evidence suggests that psychedelics, used responsibly in therapeutic context, can catalyze healing for some of the most intractable forms of mental suffering. Depression that resists all treatment, addiction that destroys lives, the existential terror of facing death, the invisible wounds of trauma. These are conditions for which conventional medicine has few answers. The psychiatric medications we have are often inadequate, laden with side effects requiring daily use indefinitely. Psychedelic therapy offers a different model: intensive, short-term, transformative. It doesn't manage symptoms, it aims to catalyze fundamental psychological change. If the ongoing clinical trials continue to show positive results, and if these therapies are eventually approved and made widely available, it could represent a genuine revolution in mental health care. But there are dangers in the Renaissance, dangers we must name. The commercialization of psychedelics brings risks. When profit becomes the motive, when these substances are turned into products, there is a danger of exploitation. Companies filing patents on traditional medicines, on knowledge that belongs to indigenous cultures is a form of biopiracy. Charging exorbitant amounts for therapy, making it available only to the wealthy, would create a two-tiered system where healing is a luxury good. The pharmaceutical industry has a long history of putting profit above patients. There is no reason to believe it will behave differently with psychedelics. There is also the danger of hype, of promising too much too soon. Psychedelics are not panaceas. They do not work for everyone. They carry risks, psychological risks for those with certain predispositions, and the risk of exploitation in the hands of unscrupulous or poorly trained therapists. The power dynamic in psychedelic therapy is significant. The patient is in an extremely vulnerable state. The potential for abuse, for manipulation, is real. As the field expands, as thousands of therapists are trained and clinics are opened, maintaining ethical standards and preventing harm will be an enormous challenge. And there is a deeper question, one that goes beyond therapy and medicine. What does it mean that a molecule can so profoundly alter consciousness? LSD reveals the constructed nature of our ordinary reality. Under its influence, the self dissolves, time becomes flexible, the boundaries between self and world become permeable. This is not a bug in the brain's operating system. It's a feature, a capacity that exists within human neurobiology. The default mode of consciousness, the one we inhabit every day, is not the only mode available. There are others, radically different, accessible through meditation, through intense practices, through certain plants, through molecules like LSD. This raises philosophical questions that we have barely begun to grapple with. If the self is not a fixed, permanent entity but a construct that can be dissolved and reformed, what does that mean for our concepts of identity, responsibility, and free will? If mystical experiences of unity and transcendence, can be reliably induced by a chemical, what does that mean for religion, for spirituality? Are these experiences revelations of a deeper truth, or are they simply fascinating neurological events, the brain producing illusions of meaning? The materialist would say the latter, the mystic would say the former. LSD forces the question but provides no answer. What is clear is that this molecule holds a mirror up to our society, to our values, to our priorities. The fact that we have spent 50 years and countless billions of dollars trying to eradicate it, imprisoning people for possessing it, while simultaneously watching millions suffer from mental illnesses we cannot effectively treat, is a kind of societal madness. The fact that the CIA tried to turn it into a weapon, that politicians used it as a tool to attack the counterculture, that the pharmaceutical industry is now trying to turn it into a blockbuster drug, all of this reveals our confused, contradictory relationship with consciousness itself. We want to control it, to suppress certain states, to enhance others, to medicate it, to monetize it. But we don't really understand it. The story of LSD is ultimately a story about power. Who has the power to define reality, to dictate what experiences are legitimate, to control access to altered states of consciousness? The establishment tried to maintain that power through prohibition, through propaganda, through violence. The counterculture tried to seize that power through mass experimentation, through cultural revolution. The CIA tried to wield that power through coercion and secrecy. And now, the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry are trying to reclaim that power through professionalization and commercialization. But the power ultimately resides in the molecule itself, in the experience it produces, an experience that is deeply personal, subjective, and resistant to control. Albert Hofmann, who lived to be 102 years old, never stopped believing in LSD's potential. In his later years, he called it his problem child, a term of endearment mixed with sorrow. He was proud of his discovery but saddened by what had been done with it, by the recklessness, by the prohibition, by the lost decades of research. He believed that if psychedelics were used wisely, with respect and care, they could be tools for healing and for understanding. He also believed that modern Western society, with its materialism and disconnection from nature, desperately needed such tools. He saw LSD as a potential medicine for a civilization that had lost its way. Whether he was right remains to be seen. We are living through the experiment in real time. The Renaissance is fragile. It could lead to a genuine transformation in how we treat mental illness, how we understand consciousness, how we relate to each other and to the world, or it could collapse into another cycle of hype, backlash, and prohibition. The outcome depends on choices we make now, about regulation, about ethics, about who profits and who benefits, about whether we learn from the mistakes of the past. And so, we come to the end of this long, strange journey through the history of LSD. It's a story that defies simple narratives. There are no clear heroes and villains, only human beings making choices, often with incomplete information, driven by fear, by curiosity, by ambition, by ideology. Albert Hofmann was a chemist looking for a circulatory stimulant. Sidney Gottlieb was a spy convinced he was protecting his country. Timothy Leary was a psychologist who became a prophet. The kids in the Haight-Ashbury were seekers looking for meaning. The politicians who banned it were scared. The researchers today are scientists trying to heal suffering. All of them were and are grappling with the same fundamental mystery: consciousness. That strange, private, subjective experience of being remains the final frontier, the great unknown at the centre of our existence. LSD is a key that opens certain doors, but what lies beyond those doors is not uniform, not predictable. For some, it's insight and healing. For others, it's confusion and terror. For some, it's a mystical encounter with the divine. For others, it's simply a neurological storm, fascinating but empty of transcendent meaning. The molecule doesn't choose. It simply does what it does. It disrupts the brain's normal patterns. It quiets the default mode network. It allows new connections to form. What meaning we make of that, what we see in the experience, depends on us, on our preparation, our context, our beliefs, our integration of the experience afterward. The ultimate lesson of LSD's history may be this: tools are not neutral. A hammer can build a house or crush a skull. A molecule can heal or harm. The chemistry is the same. What changes is the human context, the intention, the system within which it's used. LSD in the hands of a skilled therapist, in a safe setting, with informed consent, with careful preparation and integration, appears to be a powerful tool for healing. LSD in the hands of the CIA, used as a weapon against unsuspecting subjects, was an instrument of cruelty. LSD taken recklessly, in unsafe settings by unprepared individuals, can cause harm. The molecule is the same in all three cases. The morality, the outcome, the meaning, all of that is determined by human choices. And so, as we stand at this moment, as psychedelics re-emerge into the light, as clinical trials progress, as laws begin to change, as companies raise billions in investment, we face a choice. What do we want these substances to be? Medicine, available only through doctors and clinics, regulated and expensive. Sacraments, used in spiritual contexts, guided by trained facilitators. Commodities, recreational drugs legalized and taxed like alcohol. Tools for personal exploration, decriminalized and left to individual choice. The answer is probably some combination of all of these, a messy pluralism where different models coexist. But the conversation we have now, the policies we enact, the ethical frameworks we establish, will shape what psychedelics become in the 21st century. We must remember the lessons. We must remember MKULTRA, the hubris of thinking we can control and weaponize consciousness, the atrocities committed when institutions operate in secrecy without accountability. We must remember the excesses of the 1960s, the dangers of reckless mass experimentation without guidance, the tragedy of Charles Manson, the bad trips that traumatized people. We must remember the prohibition, the wasted decades, the research that was shut down, the millions who might have been helped but were not. All of these are warnings, cautionary tales about what can go wrong. But we must also remember the promise. We must remember the cancer patients who found peace, the alcoholics who found sobriety, the depressed who found hope, the researchers who saw in their data the outline of genuine healing. We must remember Albert Hofmann on his bicycle, terrified and amazed, glimpsing something profound. We must remember the indigenous peoples who have used these plants for millennia, who have always known what Western science is only now beginning to rediscover, that there are healing powers in these molecules, that they can be used wisely, that they demand respect. The psychedelic experience at its core is about connection. Users consistently report feelings of interconnectedness, a dissolution of the boundaries that normally separate self from other, human from nature, individual from cosmos. In a world increasingly characterized by isolation, by division, by disconnection, Perhaps this is what we need. Perhaps the value of psychedelics is not just therapeutic, not just about treating individual mental illnesses, but cultural, about remembering that we are not separate, that we are part of something larger, that the boundaries we draw are to some extent arbitrary constructs of consciousness. Or perhaps that's romantic nonsense, the same kind of utopian thinking that led to the excesses of the 1960s. Perhaps psychedelics are simply interesting neurochemical events, tools that might have some medical utility but which ultimately change nothing about the fundamental human condition. Perhaps the insight that feels so profound during the experience evaporates in the light of day, leaving nothing but a memory of having felt something important, with no lasting transformation. The debate continues, and it will continue. Science can measure brain states and clinical outcomes, but it cannot definitively answer whether the psychedelic experience is revelation or illusion, whether it shows us a deeper truth or merely convinces us that we've seen one. What cannot be debated is the history. LSD has been one of the most influential molecules of the modern era, not because it changed biochemistry or cured disease, but because it changed consciousness, and in doing so, it changed culture. It played a role in the birth of the counterculture, in the questioning of authority that characterized the 1960s and 70s. It influenced art, music, literature, philosophy, technology. The psychedelic aesthetic is embedded in our visual culture. The computer revolution was shaped by psychedelics. Steve Jobs famously said that taking LSD was one of the most important experiences of his life. The environmental movement, the mindfulness movement, the exploration of meditation and Eastern philosophy in the West, all of these were influenced, directly or indirectly, by the psychedelic experience and the questions it raised. For 80 years, this molecule has been a mirror held up to society, reflecting our fears and our hopes, our capacity for cruelty and our capacity for healing, our desire for control and our yearning for transcendence. The CIA tried to control it and failed. The government tried to suppress it and failed. The counterculture tried to use it to change the world and failed, or at least did not succeed in the way they imagined. And now, in the Renaissance, we're trying again with more caution, more science, more regulation. Perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps we've learned from the past. Perhaps the framework of medicine, of therapy, will allow psychedelics to fulfill their potential without the excesses and the backlash. Or perhaps we're doomed to repeat the cycle, to swing from prohibition to permissiveness and back again, never quite finding the balance. The story is not over. It's still being written. New chapters are unfolding in research labs, in courtrooms, in state legislatures, in therapy rooms, in the lived experiences of thousands of people who are, right now, having psychedelic experiences, some guided and legal, some not. The molecule continues to do what it has always done. It disrupts, it reveals, it questions. It forces us to confront the mystery of consciousness, the fragility of the self, the constructed nature of reality. These are not comfortable confrontations. They're challenging, sometimes terrifying, potentially transformative. They're also, for some people, profoundly necessary. Albert Hofmann called LSD his problem child. The term is apt. Like any child, it has caused its parents both joy and sorrow, pride and shame. It has exceeded expectations and fallen short of hopes. It has gone places it was never meant to go, been used in ways never intended, survived attempts to destroy it. And like any child, it has its own nature, its own trajectory, ultimately independent of what we want it to be. We did not create the psychedelic experience, we discovered it, stumbled upon it, both in laboratory accidents and in ancient rituals. It's a capacity that exists within the human brain, within the natural world. All we've done is found chemical keys to unlock it. The question is not whether psychedelics will continue to exist. They will. The knowledge cannot be erased, the compounds cannot be uninvented, the human hunger for altered states cannot be legislated away. The question is how we will relate to them. Will we approach them with wisdom, with respect, with humility? Will we acknowledge both their power and their danger? Will we create systems that allow for their beneficial use while minimizing harm? Will we learn from our history, or are we condemned to repeat it? These are not abstract questions. They have real consequences for real people. For the veteran with PTSD who might find relief in MDMA therapy, for the patient with depression who has tried every medication and found no help, for the alcoholic who has been through rehab a dozen times, for the person dying of cancer who is terrified of death, for the researcher trying to understand consciousness, for the indigenous person watching their sacred medicine be patented and sold, for the taxpayer funding the drug war, for the person sitting in prison for possessing a substance that is less harmful than alcohol. All of them are stakeholders in this story. All of them are affected by the choices we make about psychedelics. And perhaps most importantly, there are questions for each of us as individuals. In a world where consciousness can be reliably and dramatically altered by a molecule, where the self can be dissolved and reformed, where mystical experiences can be induced in a laboratory, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves? Are we our neurochemistry? Are the boundaries of the self real or illusory? Is ordinary consciousness privileged, or is it simply one mode among many? What authority do we grant to experiences that occur under the influence of substances? These are ancient philosophical questions, but psychedelics make them urgent and personal. The doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley called them, stand before us. LSD is one key. There are others: psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, meditation, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, near-death experiences. All of them suggest that consciousness is far stranger, far more flexible than our everyday experience suggests. Behind the doors lie experiences that can be beautiful or terrifying, meaningful or confusing, healing or harmful. The doors themselves are neutral. What matters is whether we approach them with wisdom, whether we have guides, whether we're prepared for what we might find, whether we can integrate what we learn. For 8 decades, we have struggled with these questions. We have tried to weaponize the doors, to lock them, to monetize them, to sacralize them. We have hurt people in the process, and we have helped people. We have learned, and we have forgotten, and we are learning again. The story of LSD is, ultimately, the story of humanity's relationship with its own consciousness, with the mystery of subjective experience, with the perennial question, what is it like to be, and what else could it be like? The answer, whispered by the molecule itself, is stranger than you think, and more than you are ready for. But perhaps with care and with wisdom, we are learning to be ready. Perhaps this time, we will not repeat the mistakes of the past. Perhaps we will find a way to use these powerful tools for healing and for understanding, without exploitation, without cruelty, without utopian delusions or authoritarian nightmares. Perhaps. The molecule waits, colourless, odourless, crystalline, potent beyond belief, locked in laboratories and hidden in underground chemists' workbenches, sitting in evidence rooms and research facilities, waiting. It has outlasted the CIA, outlasted Nixon and Reagan, outlasted the war on drugs, outlasted the counterculture that embraced it and the establishment that tried to destroy it. It will outlast us too. Long after our current debates are forgotten, long after today's laws have been rewritten, the molecule will remain, a chemical constant in an ever-changing human world. And somewhere, in a laboratory or a clinic or a living room, someone is having the experience right now. Their pupils are dilated, their perceptions are shifting, the walls are breathing, the boundaries are dissolving. They're terrified or ecstatic or both. They're confronting demons or meeting gods or simply watching colours that have no names. They're asking the questions that humans have always asked. Who am I? What is real? Why are we here? And the molecule, indifferent to their questions, is simply doing what it does, opening the doors, not providing answers but deepening the mystery, revealing that consciousness is vaster and stranger than we knew, and that the journey into it has only just begun. This is the history of LSD, not a complete history, for much remains hidden, classified, forgotten, or unknown, but a history nonetheless, a chronicle of discovery and disaster, of ambition and atrocity, of prohibition and renaissance, a story of a molecule and the humans who found it, used it, abused it, feared it, loved it, and struggled to understand it. A story that is not finished, that continues to unfold, that you, in reading this, are now a part of. The problem child grows up, the doors remain, and the question endures, will we walk through them with wisdom, or will we continue to stumble, as we have for the past 80 years, between fear and fascination, never quite learning, never quite understanding, forever changed but never quite transformed? The only certainty is this: the journey continues, the molecule persists, and the mystery, the profound, irreducible mystery of consciousness remains. LSD is just one key to one set of doors. but what a key it has been, what doors it has opened, what it has revealed about us, about our minds, about our institutions, about our capacity for both brilliance and brutality. We are not done with it, and it is not done with us. The next chapter is being written now. What it will say, we do not yet know. But we can hope that we have learned something, that we will be wiser, that we will be kinder, that we will finally approach these powerful tools with the respect and humility they demand. If we do, perhaps Hofmann's problem child will finally become what he always hoped it could be. Not a weapon, not a recreational drug, not a commodity, but a medicine for the mind and the spirit, a tool for healing in a broken world. The bicycle ride continues, the doors remain open, and the choice, as always, is ours.